Hey everybody, this is Games Plus James and welcome back to our Unity Endless Runner tutorial where we're taking a look at how to make a basic and awesome Endless Runner game. So last time we talked about adding some animation to our player, and that's what we're going to do here today. So we've got our character guy just kind of standing there like that, but if we go back to our art file here and into our sprite sheet and into our sprite editor, we can see we've used this green guy, and there's a few other kind of frames of animation here for this guy that we can use and make him look like he's walking a bit and make him look like he's jumping in the air. So we're going to go and grab a few of these frames. So we're going to grab this first one here. We'll just roughly draw a box around him to start off with. We'll just zoom out a little bit. And we're going to grab this guy also, and those will be our two frames for our walk animation. And then this one here is what we're going to use for when our guy is jumping up in the air. So if we just go back in here, and much like we did with the very first episode, we want to tidy up the edges here so that they're touching the edge of the character. And just like that. There we go, perfect. And we want to make sure our pivot point is set to the bottom, because it's important to make sure that our pivot on all of these frames is set to the exact same place. For example, if we had it in the center of this guy and the bottom of this guy, when our animation happened, it would start off at the bottom here, but say our guy started walking, and if our pivot point was up here, it would try to match those two things up. So if we started off at the bottom, then it would say, okay, the pivot is at the bottom. So if our pivot was here, suddenly our guy would appear halfway down into the ground, and that's not going to be any use to anybody. So we'll just fix up this thing as well here. We got that one pretty close, surprisingly. Just like that, and then down here just like that, perfect. And again, set our pivot point to the bottom, and if we slide down to here, if you right click you can drag yourself around this little area. So we're going to grab this box as well and make him just a little bit bigger like that, and make this size just like that there, perfect. And we'll put him as the bottom pivot also, and make sure we hit apply up here to make sure those changes take place, and we'll see a few extra guys pop in down here, and now we can go back in here. So what we're going to need to do is create animation for our player. I've got these few tabs open here, but I just close these because we need to show how to open them yourselves, and the way to do that is if we make sure we clicked on our player here and go to window and then click animation, and then grab the tab of that and we'll drag it in here just like this, and go again to window and grab the animator tab and pop that in there just like that. Now we're able to do some animations for our player. Okay, so what we're going to do first is, if we make sure our animation tab here is open, and we have to make sure we have our player selected and highlighted, we're going to create our first animation. So we click here and click create. Rather than putting it in our art folder here, we're going to go back up to assets and create a new folder, and we'll call it animations. And we'll go in here, and we're going to call this one player underscore idle. So this will just be the animation. We won't really see this animation. This is only going to occur if the player for some reason isn't moving or jumping. And the way we're going to make sure we have this will just be our normal guy standing. So that was our first sprite that we had. So we're going to grab him and just drag him onto the timeline there, and it'll appear at the first frame, and that'll just endlessly play that one frame of this guy here. So that's fine. So what we're going to do next is, if we click on player idle, it'll create a little drop down here, and we're going to create a new clip, and we're going to call this player run, and we're going to save that. And this time what we're going to do is select these two guys here. So if we select the first one, then hold control and select the next guy, we're going to drag both of them over here onto the frame like that. And now that we have two frames of animation, if we just zoom in here a little bit, we've got two little frame guys here. Now that we've got two frames of animation, we can see how that would look like on our player in action. So if we hit that play button here, we can see he's running like a crazy little maniac. If we zoom in on him, he's moving way too fast. We can't possibly see our player moving that fast. So if we unplay that, we've got 60 frames of animation going here. That's way too fast for our needs. So if what we're going to do is put that down to something way more reasonable, like 9 frames of animation. If we press play here, now we can see his legs moving. So he actually looks like he's actually moving something here. He's not just crazily fidgeting like a maniac. So we're going to stop that running now. We'll zoom this out a little bit, and we're going to create one more animation, and we're going to call this player underscore jump is the other one we need. Player jump. And for that, we're going to get our final little sprite here. Just grab this guy, pop him in there, and then, just an example, if we hit play here, all he's going to do is just endlessly be looking like he's dancing a little bit, but it'll make more sense when he's jumping in the air. So now we need to connect these animations together and set up a ways for our player, when the game is running, to be able to use these things. Because if we click back the game here and if we press play now, we've created these animations, but we've no way of activating them. So he still just looks like he's sliding along the ground like a crazy little maniac. So that's why we have our animator tab here. So if we click on player again, now we can see those 3 animations that we created, our player idle, player run, and player jump, have appeared here in our animator, which is attached to a player. And our animator was automatically generated on our player when we created it the first time. So if we scroll down here, we can see now we've got an animator attached to our player, and the controller given is the player controller. And this is created automatically when we created our first animation. So if we go into our animation folder here, we can see there's a player controller. So now we've got these 3 things, we want to be able to do stuff with them. So we're just going to move them around a little bit just to have them make a bit more sense. So we've got our idle, we've got when he's running, and we've got jump when he's up in the air. And we need to create connections between these events. But we need some parameters to be able to decide how we're going to be able to do them. So for example, we need to know when the player is like moving at a certain speed, which is like above 0. When he's moving above a speed of 0, we want him to start running. And then when, for example, we know when the player is on the ground now, so when he's not on the ground, we want the player to be jumping in the air. So to do that, we're going to have to click on parameters here. And our list is currently empty, but we have a little plus symbol here. We're going to hit that plus, and we're going to click float first, and we're going to call this speed. So this will be determine how fast the player is going, and we're going to create another one, public bool, and we're going to call this grounded, and this will be determining whether the player is grounded or not. So the way we're going to put those into action, we start off with our player idle. Our player idle is our starting point. If you hold Alt and click, you can drag around, and you can see we've got entry here, and this is saying where the animations will start when the scene starts running. So you can see the arrow by default is going to player idle. So this is our default idle state in the game. So when nothing else is happening, it's just going to this animation. So if we right click on this animation, we can say make transition, and then we've got a little arrow here that we can move our mouse around. If you don't click anything, it'll just stay there attached to that. But if we move over to player run, you can see it snaps into position. It just goes pop like that. And if we click on player run, now we've made a connection there. And if we click on this connection, we see we get a whole load of options over here. What happens now is, by default, Unity gives it a few settings which we won't want to use. Here we have has exit time. It's given us an exit time of 0, that's okay, but sometimes it'll automatically generate an exit time. Say it could be of 0.25 of a second. And basically what that'll say is, when we're going from one animation to another, it'll wait a quarter of a second before it moves to the next animation. So here, our player would stay idle for a quarter of a second and then start running. And that's not what we want to happen at all. Our player would look like he's sliding on the ground for a quarter of a second, and then he'd start running. So we don't want that to happen at all. So we want to uncheck has exit time there. And we've also got a fixed duration, which is, It's useful for when you're animating movement components on your player, and that will kind of blend between animations. But because we're using a sprite sheet, we don't want to have any kind of duration here. So where it says 0.25, we're going to just set that to 0. So then it'll immediately go straight to making the player run. So now we have those little things set up. We'll just drop that settings menu back up. But we want to set up our variables. Like we said, we set our speed one here. So we want to use the speed to determine when the player should start running. So down here we have conditions. We're going to click on the plus to add a new condition. And by default, it'll select the first one that we created here, which is our speed. And when speed is greater than 0, that's perfect. That's what we want to say. When the speed is greater than 0, it'll transition to making the player run. So there we go. That's perfect. So now, by default, we know our player in general is going to be running along. And if for any crazy reason our player has stopped, we don't know why that would happen, but it could potentially happen. But if our player is stopped, what we want to say is we'll make a transition back to player idle, and we'll click on this arrow again. So now we want to uncheck has exit time, and we want to set this to 0 again, just like that. And this time our condition will be if our speed is less than, say, 0.1, potentially. If the player's going that slow, that's pretty slow. So the other thing we want to do is make sure our player can jump. So he will go to jumping from running at any particular time. So if we right click on player run, click make transition, and pop it up to player jump. Click on this arrow here again, we'll uncheck exit time once again and set our transition duration to 0. Drop them back up, and this time our conditions will be, instead of speed, if we click this drop down, we've got grounded. So when grounded is false, so when he's not on the ground anymore, then our player will transition to this jump animation. And again, much like we did with our switching back to our player idle, we want to do the same thing again with player run. We want to pop back, so we right click on a player jump, make a transition down to player run, and uncheck exit time again, get rid of our transition duration. And here we're going to say when grounded is true. So then when grounded is true, we know he's returned to the ground, so he can go back to running along like a maniac. So there you go, that's our basic transitions all set up. But of course, these are all just values that we've decided to use within the animator. There's no way for our player object or our player script to know what's going on with this animation. So again, we've set up all these animations, but they won't do anything for us. If we hit play, still our player will just be sliding along the ground. He's not animating, he's not moving or anything. He's not doing anything useful for us. So we need to edit our script, our player script. So we'll go back in here again, back into our player controller, much as we've done in the previous script. And now we're going to use, once again, another variable to control our animator, which is attached to our player. So much like we've done for our rigid body and for our collider 2D, which are attached to the player, we're going to create a new private animator. And the animator, if we just slide this over here, we can't see it on the player. If we just click on the player, down here we see we've got an animator component attached to our player. So we're going to say private animator. We will call this my animator. So then down in our start function here, just as I said, just like we did with our rigid body and our collider, we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to say my animator is equal to get component animator, and that will find the animator that is attached to our player. And we always want to do these in our start function because it'll only happen once at the very start of the game. If you were to continually do a get component every single frame of animation, that would be really taxing on the system and would just inevitably slow down your game. So that's why we do it once at the very start and have this variable created so we don't have to call it every single time we want to make a change to the animator. So now down here at the end of our update loop, and just in case you've got like a whole load of different stuff in your update loop at any point in your system and you're not sure which, see here we've got like 4 close brackets in a row and you're not sure which one is the one you want to use. If you click on the very first one which is the opening of the update function, it will automatically highlight the bracket that's closing that. So now we know that our close bracket is here, so we can go before that, which is this one here, and if we just hit enter and make a few extra little spaces there just like that, we can adjust settings within our animator down here after we've already decided whether the player is running along or if the player is jumping in the air. So here we're going to say my animator dot set float. So what that'll do is it'll just set a float value that is on the animator, and the name of the float value that we want to set, we put it inside some quotation marks here, and the name that we gave that controls the speed of the player is the speed, and what we want to do is grab the speed of our player controller at the moment. So we know that our speed of our object is on our rigid body and it's on our velocity, and obviously the speed going from left to right is the x value. So we'll say my rigid body dot velocity dot x. So that'll get the x value of the rigid velocity, or the rigid body velocity, and it will say, okay, that's the speed value that we want to use in the animator. So if we go back in here and into our animator, that's the speed value that will be used here on the player. And in the exact same way, we're going to affect the grounded value here. And how we're going to do that is make sure we put our semicolon at the end there, of course. My animator dot set bool. And as we know, a bool value is either a true or false value, and that's what we've used here for our grounded here. So we know whether our character is grounded or not. And we're going to say, okay, the value that we want to change is our grounded value over here. So capital G grounded inside quotation marks, then a comma, and the value we want to give it is our grounded value, because this is how we know whether the player is grounded or not. And we'll just say grounded there like that. And we're going to, of course, end with another semicolon, and we're going to save this, and we're going to pop back into Unity, and we're going to let things compile down here. And now that we have our animator all set up and we have our script adjusted to be able to send information to the animator, once we hit play here, we should see that, there we go, look, now we've got a nice little walking animation on our player. That was probably a little bit late for us to see, but he did jump in the air. If we hit jump, there we go, we can see he's jumping in the air just like we want him to. We'll just hit maximize on play here, so now when we play it, it'll jump at full screen size, and we can see, oh, he's jumping in the air, he's walking along. Perfect. So now we've got a nice little bit of a very simple, obviously, animation for our character, but it works nicely for our purposes here in our little tutorial. So now that we've got the animation in place, we want our camera to be able to follow the player and be able to not just watch him disappearing off to the side. So we're going to write a very, very simple camera controller script to attach to our camera. So we're going to create a new script in our script folder here, create C# script, and we're going to call this camera controller. I'm going to open that up in MonoDevelop if it'll let me. There we go, now it's opening. And while that's opening there, we're going to click on our camera and we're going to add that script to it. So type into our search bar camera, and we'll see it pops up, and click on camera controller. Obviously there's no variables attached to that yet, but we're going to sort that out in a second. Okay, so we'll pop in here. So we need to know a couple of things to start off with. First of all, we need to know where the player is. So to find where the player is, we need to know what is the player. And so our player, we know, has the player controller script attached to it. And since we've created that script, now within our camera controller script, we're able to access that. So if we go here and we'll say public player controller, which is our player controller script, we're going to use that, and we're going to call the variable the player. So that'll be what we use to store our player, basically. And then within our start function, much like we did in our player controller script, in this script we got a component that was attached to the body, but our camera obviously isn't attached to our player. So we're going to use a different method to find the player. So we're going to say the player is equal to find object of type. And make sure it's not find objects of type with an S there. We don't want an S. We only want one. And we're going to say inside these sharp brackets, like we did before, we're going to say player controller, which is what our player is. And then we're going to put some normal brackets at the end there, just like that. So now, as soon as the game starts, it'll go, okay, we know what the player controller is. Here it is. Okay, that's the one we're using with the camera. So we want to know where the position of that player is. So we're going to use a variable here. We're going to use private vector tree, and we're going to call this last player position. So much like we use in our player controller script, we use a vector2 to get the x value and the y value. A vector tree has an x value, a y value, and also a z value, which is the depth of the depth of the position within the world. So the way Unity works, when you're not dealing with the 2D physics specifically, for example, with this camera, this is a 3D object within the world that has an x, y, and a z value, and we want to store the position of the player. So if we just click on the player here, we can see he's got an x, y, and a z value. Our z value won't matter for any of the physics we're doing within the game at all, but it's just something that's included by default within Unity. So back in our camera controller script, we're going to store the position of the player in a vector tree. So we'll have an x, y, and a z value of where the player is. And what we want to do is move the camera by a certain amount as the player is moving. So we're going to use another value here, a private float, which, as we've covered before, a float is simply just a number value. So a private float, and we're going to call this distance to move. So our last player position is going to be the x, y, and z position of the player at the last moment in time. So in our update loop, we're going to have, at the end of every update, we're going to say, okay, the last player position is now the position of where the player is at this moment in time. So last player position is equal to the player, which is our player controller script, and every object within Unity has a positional value associated with that. And you can see here we've got a position, rotation, and a scale, and that's within the transform component of the object. So every object within a game in Unity will have a transform component within it to determine where it is in space. So we'll say the player dot transform, which is this component up here, and we want a position. So the player dot transform dot position, if I could spell position it'd be nice. There we go. So our last player position is now the player.transform.position. And what that does is we have a vector tree, which is x, y, and z, and it'll take those x, y's, and z's from here and just pop them straight in there for us. And that's going to happen at the end of every loop. But we also want to make sure that that's set at the very start of the game too. So we'll copy this exactly and just paste it in there. So the very first time it runs, it has a value for us to do. And our distance that we want our camera to move is basically going to be the difference between what the player's position was last time and what it currently is. So say on the last frame he was at position say x3, and this time he's moved to the right a little bit, so now his x position is 4. So what we want to do is say, okay, we've got 3 and a 4, our new position is 4, our previous position was 3, so we want to take away that. So 4 minus 3, we've got 1. So we know that 1 is the amount of movement that we have. So we want to move our camera forward by 1 in the exact same way. And the way we're going to do that here within Unity is say our distance to move value, which is distance to move, is equal to where the player currently is. So the player dot transform dot position dot x, because we are only concerned about where he's moving left to right, so his x value there, minus the last position he was in, so our last player position, dot x, because we're only taking the x value from that vector tree variable there. So we'll put a semicolon. So now we know that our distance to move, say in our example, the player was currently at position 4. Last time he was at position 3. So 4 minus 3 is equal to 1. So now our distance to move is 1. So we know that the camera has to move by 1. And the way we do that is very simply saying transform dot position. So what transform dot position does is essentially what that says is the transform of the current object. So we don't have to say like the player's transform, we don't specifically have to say the camera's transform, because we know that this script is attached to the camera. We can just say, okay, transform dot position, which is the transform of the current object that this script is attached to, and we're going to get the position of that. So we're going to say the position of that is now equal to a new vector tree, because we want to use an x, y, and a z value. And we're going to say take the transform dot position dot x that we're currently at and add to that our distance to move. So distance to move there, and we put a comma there, and we don't want to change the y value or the z value, so we'll just say transform dot position dot y and transform dot position dot z. Perfect. So now the camera will know, okay, we have a distance that our camera needs to move, so we'll add that to our current position and it'll move it along horizontally. But because we're not changing the y value or the z value, now when our player's running along, if he jumps up in the air, the camera won't jump up and down with him. It'll just keep moving along as the player is moving along left to right. So now if we go back in here, we're going to wait for this to compile down here. And on our camera, we can see now we've got a variable for the player, but we don't need to fill that in because the player is automatically being found by our script. So if we hit play this time, we should see that the camera will follow the player, but if we jump up and down, he won't be able to, or the camera won't be able to follow up and down. So see, now we've got the player walking along on platforms. He falls off the screen. If we were to create something that will kill the player when he falls off the screen, that would obviously be very handy, because we don't want to just be stuck in our game here looking at a blank screen. But now we can see the camera is just following the player as he goes along, but not following his height up and down, which is exactly what we want to happen. So there you go. That's our basics of our camera and our animation looking good and looking smooth in operation here. Next time we're going to take a look at making some platforms for a player to jump on so he doesn't just have this one place to fall off and die from. And we're going to make sure that we can keep them generating over and over time and make sure that there's always more platforms for our player to jump on. So make sure you return for the next part of our Endless Runner tutorial in the very near future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Thanks for checking out this episode, and if you want even more Games Plus James goodness, make sure you hit those subscribe and like buttons. You can also find me on Twitter and Facebook by following the links on screen, where you can find out all the latest news about the channel. And if you want to help support the show, check out the Patreon page, where you can get exclusive content in return for helping make the channel even better. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.